I've covered some fascinating trials over the years and watched as prosecutors have used various kinds of evidence to convict defendants. One case that stands out in my mind involves a Chicago mobster by the name of Harry Alleman. Harry was a notorious crime syndicate hitman. He was on trial for murdering a Teamsters Union shop steward. I'd written a lot of stories about Harry over the years because he was a suspect in at least a dozen different murders. I remember one time Harry Alleman cornered me and he pointed a finger really menacingly in my face and he said, "Why do you keep writing these stories about me?" And I'll tell you what, coming from a guy of his reputation, it was a little bit intimidating. But the prosecutors had their own challenges with the case against Harry Alleman. The good news was that the getaway driver agreed to testify against Harry. The bad news was he demanded leniency in return. And the prosecutors knew that when the jurors found that out, it would call into question his motivation for testifying. They needed corroborating evidence. They needed someone else to back up what the accomplice was saying. And sure enough, they found a neighbor of the murder victim who testified that he was out walking his dog when he saw Harry Alleman commit the crime. They put him in a witness protection program. He testified against Harry Alleman, so did the accomplice. Harry was convicted, and today he's spending the rest of his life behind bars. That is the power of corroborating evidence in a court of law. The question is, do we have any corroboration for the New Testament of the Bible? Do we have any evidence outside the Bible that corroborates what the New Testament tells us about Jesus? Following the pattern of my investigation, my next step was to determine whether or not there was any evidence outside the New Testament that corroborates what the New Testament tells us.
Jesus, of course, wasn't the emperor of the Roman Empire. He wasn't some autocrat that had conquered half of the world, but he did leave an impact in his own environment and created a movement that grew from there. And there is a remarkable amount of documents and corroboration. Josephus refers to him. The Roman historian Tacitus refers to him. Suetonius, the political writer, refers to him. Critics refer to him. And so it's like a stone thrown into a pond. The ripples go out and everywhere are felt. It's a very impressive record taken as a whole.
In AD 93, the Jewish historian Josephus published his work, Antiquities of the Jews. Scholars generally agree that the following text accurately records Josephus' record of Jesus.
Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. When Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him first did not forsake him. And the tribe of Christians, so named for him, are not extinct to this day.
In a court of law, the rebuttal case is an opportunity for the other side to present their evidence. Well, in recent years, there's been a proliferation of books and articles about the so-called Gnostic Gospels. And I wanted to figure out, does this represent the mainstream of academic scholarship?
The Gnostic Gospels are a collection of religious writings from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They blend the teachings of Jesus with a variety of ancient philosophical beliefs. According to the tenets of Gnosticism, the universe was the creation of a flawed and wicked God. Therefore, all matter was evil. Salvation from this world could only be attained through secret knowledge about the spiritual nature of man.
There's been a lot of talk about the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas. These documents are almost universally recognized to be much later than the New Testament Gospels and not to record historically reliable material related to Jesus.
Well, the New Testament Gospels give us a portrait of an early first century Palestinian Jesus of Nazareth. The Gospels from the 2nd century, which are mostly Gnostic Gospels, such as the Gospel of Judas, or the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Philip, or the Gospel of Mary, they give us a very different Jesus. Now, you can pick and choose if you want. You can say, well, I like the 2nd century Gnostic Jesus better. Others might want the early 1st century Palestinian Jesus. But if you're going to be a scholar about it, and you're going to talk about, well, which Gospels really do give us earlier traditions that more reliably reflect the actual historical Jesus, you got to go with the New Testament Gospels every time.
There's a view among some that there were all of these different competing views of Jesus Christ, and that the one that won out became the orthodox perspective of Christ reflected in the Gospels. All the evidence runs contrary to that. Jesus was a 1st century Jewish teacher who revealed and demonstrated himself to be the Messiah. That's the presentation we get in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the New Testament Gospels. These later Gospels, these Gnostic Gospels, present a very different Jesus, almost a Greek philosopher, an esoteric Gnostic Jesus. It's clearly not the authentic historical Jesus.
What I've come to discover is that the Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are our best sources for Jesus. And I've also found that they are reliable, and that from these sources we can form a picture that I believe is very accurate, that tells us about Jesus, what he taught, how he was perceived by his contemporaries, and what his life was really all about.
Everything from Jesus' parables, to his healings, to his controversies, to his warnings, and all of that, the reason they were telling this stuff is that not just it was good advice for them in their own day, but that it actually mattered, that it actually happened. And if it hadn't happened, you're into a totally different worldview, a worldview which is about ideas, which is about self-realization, hugely popular in our culture just now, discovering who I really am. You know, for goodness sake, Jesus didn't come to help me discover who I really am. He came to tell me who he knew I really was and to do something about it. And that's much better news.
I remember one time a witness was called in a murder trial I was covering for the Chicago Tribune. He was supposed to testify that he had seen the defendant shoot the victim. But instead, he shocked everybody by saying, "I shot him." Later, the defendant got in the stand and said, "Yeah, that's right. He shot him, not me." Suddenly, the jury had two conflicting stories. Prosecutors had strong evidence that the defendant was guilty. But now there was another version of events that flatly contradicted that. In the end, though, several other eyewitnesses confirmed that the defendant was guilty and that the witness who confessed was merely trying to cover for him. With overwhelming evidence of his guilt, the defendant was convicted. In a similar way, we have the New Testament painting one picture of Jesus, but the so-called alternative Gospels telling another story. Well, which is right? Well, the evidence strongly supports the New Testament. Unlike the Gnostic Gospels, they're based on eyewitness testimony, they're written very close to the events they describe, and they're confirmed at points by archaeology and secular history. Consequently, I believe that we can have confidence that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John contain the most reliable information about Jesus. Well, how about you? Where would you say the arrow of evidence at this juncture points? Toward or away from the Gospels being reliable?